I have always been a poor swimmer. My mother used to say it like a warning, not a confession. Emma, you fight the water instead of trusting it. I never understood what she meant until the night the river nearly kept me. It was November, and the bridge on Hanover Street was slick with rain that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be fog. I was walking home from my third shift of the week at the Meridian Hotel, a catering job that paid just enough to keep the heat on and not quite enough to keep the anxiety from climbing up my throat every time I checked my bank balance. My feet ached inside the cheap flats I'd worn for 11 hours straight. My uniform, a plain white button-down and black trousers, was damp at the collar from carrying too many trays in a room packed with people who never once looked at my face. That was the worst part of the job, honestly. Not the weight of the trays or the hours, or even the manager who smelled like cigarettes and called everyone sweetheart regardless of their preferences. It was the invisibility. 300 guests in a ballroom, and not one of them saw me. I was a hand delivering champagne. A pair of shoulders slipping between conversations, a uniform without a person inside it. The rain picked up as I crossed the bridge. I pulled my jacket tighter, a thin thing, useless against real cold, and kept my eyes on the far end of the bridge where the streetlights were at least pretending to work. The river below was black and loud, swollen from 2 days of rain upstream. I could hear it rushing even from up here, impatient and enormous, indifferent to everything above it. I don't know exactly how it happened. One moment I was walking. The next, my heel caught the edge of a drainage grate that was loose. I felt it give under my weight, that sickening tilt of ground that shouldn't tilt. And then the railing was against my back, and the railing was old, and the railing did not hold. The cold hit me like a wall, not gradually. Not the way cold happens when you step outside in winter. This was total and immediate, a full-body erasure. The river swallowed the sound of the city, swallowed the rain, swallowed me. I went under fast, and the current was nothing like what I'd imagined from above. It had hands, or something like hands. Something that grabbed and pulled without mercy, rolling me sideways, stealing my sense of up and down. My jacket filled with water and became an anchor. My shoes dragged. I tried to kick, tried to scream, and the river filled my mouth instead. My mother was right. I was fighting it. But there was nothing to trust down there. Nothing at all. I don't remember surfacing. I only remember the moment strong hands closed around my arm. Not gently, not carefully, but with the kind of grip that means business. The kind of grip that says you are not dying tonight without a single word spoken. I was dragged upward, and then onto something solid, the edge of the embankment below the bridge, a muddy concrete ledge that bit into my knees when I landed on it. I was coughing river water and shaking so hard my teeth clicked together like a metronome. For a moment I couldn't see anything. My eyes wouldn't focus. The cold had reached my brain. I think everything was slow and blurred, like footage taken underwater. Then I blinked, and he was there. I registered fragments before I registered a person. Dark fabric, expensive even soaked through, the kind of wool that costs more than my monthly rent. A white dress shirt beneath, the collar open, no tie. Then his face, and I made some embarrassing sound low in my throat because his face was... It was the kind of face that made you briefly forget that you had nearly just drowned. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that caught the light from the street above us with an intensity that wasn't quite warmth. He was young. That surprised me more than anything. I'd expected someone older, more ordinary. He couldn't have been more than 30, and yet there was something about the way he held himself, crouched at my level on that narrow ledge, that made him seem like a person accustomed to being the most significant thing in any room. Ink curved up from his collar. Tattoos, dark and elaborate, spreading across his throat and disappearing beneath his shirt. I stared at them longer than was polite, but I was still half drowned, so I forgave myself. He said something in Korean, low and sharp, and I heard movement above us. The bridge. Someone up there responding. He wasn't alone. Of course he wasn't alone. Men like that were never alone. Then he looked back at me, and his expression shifted into something more careful. "Can you stand?" His English was precise, controlled. The accent slight but present, each word deliberate, as if language were another thing he'd decided to master completely. I tried. My legs disagreed. He didn't wait. He simply moved, one arm coming under mine, lifting me with an ease that was almost offensive, given that I was dead weight and entirely soaked through. His hand at my ribs was warm through the wet fabric, shockingly warm, like he was burning from the inside. I became aware, suddenly, of how I must look. Hair plastered to my face. Mascara halfway down my cheeks. My uniform ruined, transparent in places from the water. Catering badge still clipped to my chest, reading Emma, staff in cheerful bold letters. He glanced at the badge. Something crossed his expression, quick as a shadow. "Emma," he said, and it didn't sound like a question. A black car appeared at the end of the embankment path. I hadn't even seen the path before, headlights cutting through the rain. A man climbed out of the driver's seat and jogged toward us without being told. He was larger, broad-shouldered, with the quiet efficiency of someone paid to appear when needed and ask nothing. I was shaking so hard I could barely form words. But I managed. "Thank you. I'll be fine. I can call someone." "You'll get in the car." It wasn't unkind. It was simply the way he said things. Statements, not suggestions. A voice that had stopped bothering to dress itself as a request. I don't know you." I was aware of how weak that sounded. I was aware that he had just pulled me out of a river, and I was arguing with him on a concrete ledge in the rain. But something in me pushed back instinctively against that tone, against the certainty of it. He looked at me for a long moment. Those dark eyes moved across my face with the same focused calm with which I imagined he looked at everything, assessing, filing, deciding. "No," he said, "you don't." He turned toward the car, and the large man immediately came forward, producing a blanket from somewhere, a real blanket, thick and dark, that was wrapped around my shoulders before I'd processed the gesture. I was guided toward the car door. The seats inside were the color of charcoal and smelled of cedar and something sharper beneath, something I couldn't name. I sat. The door closed. He walked around to the other side with the unhurried precision of a man who had never once moved in a way that was unintentional. The car pulled away from the bridge, and through the rain-streaked window I watched the river disappear behind us, black and indifferent, already forgetting I'd been in it at all. He didn't speak again. Neither did I. By the time we reached the part of the city where the streetlights were prettier and the buildings taller, my shaking had slowed enough for coherent thought. And coherent thought arrived in the form of one clear, quiet terror. I had no idea where we were going. I had not asked. I had climbed into a car with a man whose name I didn't know, who had tattoos climbing his throat, and men who appeared without being summoned, and I had not asked a single question. I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me. He had been looking at me, I realized, the entire time. His name, I learned, was Sungmin. Not from him. He didn't offer it that night. I learned it the way I learned most things about him in those early days. Sideways, through gaps. The way light comes through shutters rather than windows. The large man in the front seat said it once, quietly, in Korean, and something about the single word landed in my ears with the weight of something significant. I filed it away without knowing why. He took me to a hotel. Not my neighborhood, not my apartment building with its broken elevator and the neighbor who played guitar badly after midnight. A hotel in the kind of district where doormen wore white gloves and the lobby smelled of fresh lilies changed daily. He spoke to the front desk in a murmur I couldn't catch. And within 4 minutes, I counted because counting was the only thing keeping me from unraveling completely. I was being handed a key card and told that dry clothes and dinner would be brought to my room. I stood at the elevator with the blanket still around my shoulders and turned back to find him. He was already near the exit, his back to me, one hand lifting to his ear, a phone appearing from nowhere. The broad-shouldered man at his side, both of them moving with the kind of coordinated quiet that made them look like a single organism. At the door, he paused. Not long, just a fraction of a second, the way a person pauses when they feel watched. He didn't turn around. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. And that was the end of the first night. I told myself it was over. I told myself this the next morning, wrapped in the hotel's white robe, eating the breakfast that had appeared outside my door at 7 a.m., without my asking. I told myself this while wearing the dry clothes that had been left the night before. A simple dark sweater, soft trousers, both the right size in a way that unsettled me quietly. I told myself it was over while the hotel bill presented to me at checkout read settled in clean printed letters. A zero balance where a number should have been. I went home. I showered in my own bathroom with its perpetually low water pressure. I washed the river out of my hair properly, standing under the weak spray until the water ran clear and cold. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at my hands for a while, and thought about dark eyes and tattooed throats and a voice that said, "You'll get in the car the way gravity said you will fall." 3 days passed. I went to work. I carried trays and refilled glasses and remained invisible, which was familiar, and therefore almost comforting. I told no one about the bridge. There was no version of that story that didn't sound either like a trauma or a fantasy, and I wasn't sure yet which category it belonged to. On the 4th day, the manager at the Meridian called me into his office and told me my position was being eliminated. "Budget restructuring," he said, not meeting my eyes. I was given 2 weeks of severance in an envelope and a handshake that felt like an apology he hadn't bothered to fully commit to. I walked out of that building into a gray afternoon with $80 in my checking account, 2 weeks of rent money in a plain envelope, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from having worked hard, but from having worked hard for nothing. I stood on the sidewalk outside the Meridian for a long time. Then, because I had nowhere else to be and nothing particularly left to lose, I did the thing I had been arguing myself out of for 4 days. I went to find him. I want to be clear about what I was thinking, because it mattered then and it matters now in the telling. I was not thinking about the way he looked. I was not thinking about the weight of his hand through wet fabric or the steadiness of his voice. I was thinking, with the specific desperation of someone watching their savings disappear, that he had paid for a hotel room and breakfast and dry clothes without being asked, and that suggested a person with resources, and that perhaps, there was work to be found in that direction. Catering, hospitality, anything. It was a thin logic. I knew it was thin, but thin logic is still logic when you're frightened, and I was frightened. The problem was I didn't know where to find him. What I had was a memory. The blanket had come from the car. The car had collected us from the embankment near Hanover Bridge. And before it arrived, he had spoken on a phone, or someone above on the bridge had, because there had been a voice from up there, brief and Korean, which meant someone had been on that bridge when I fell. I went back to the bridge. I don't know what I expected to find. A business card wedged in the railing, perhaps. The universe accommodating my poor planning. What I found instead was an older man in a dark coat feeding pigeons at the far end, who looked up when I approached with the expression of someone who had expected me earlier. He said, in careful English, "Miss Emma." I stopped walking. "Mr. Shungmin thought you might come." He reached into his coat and produced a card. Actual cardstock, heavy and cream-colored, with nothing on it but a phone number. No name, no address. "When you are ready." He went back to the pigeons. The conversation apparently was finished. I waited 2 more days before I called. Dignity, I told myself. Though what dignity remained to a woman who had shown up at a bridge looking for a man she didn't know was debatable. He answered on the second ring. Emma. Not a greeting exactly. More like an acknowledgement. You exist? I am aware of you. Proceed. I wanted to say thank you, I said. Properly. And I also wanted to ask if you knew of any work. In hospitality, catering. I'm experienced. I've been doing it for 3 years. I just lost my position and I stopped myself. I was rambling. I sounded exactly as desperate as I was. I'm sorry. This was probably a mistake. Silence. Long enough that I pulled the phone from my ear to check if the call had dropped. Dinner, he said. Tonight. I'll send an address. The call ended. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone and understanding, with sudden clarity, that I had made a very significant mistake, though I couldn't yet name exactly what kind. The address arrived 40 minutes later in a text from an unknown number. It was a restaurant in the financial district, the kind with no sign visible from the street, and a name so understated it was nearly invisible on the door. Sora. I had walked past it 100 times delivering catering to nearby buildings, and never once considered that I might enter it as a guest. I wore the only dress I owned that qualified as nice. Deep burgundy, simple cut, bought 2 years ago for a cousin's wedding, and worn twice since. Gold hoops. The necklace my grandmother left me, thin and warm against my collarbone. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time before leaving, trying to determine what exactly I was walking toward. I had no answer. I went anyway. The restaurant's interior was dark wood and candlelight, and the kind of quiet that costs money to maintain. A host materialized before I'd fully stepped through the door and led me through the main room, past tables of people in the kind of clothes that don't have prices. Toward the back, through a door I hadn't noticed, into a smaller room separated from the rest. Private. Of course it was private. He was already seated. Dark suit tonight, jacket on, one button at the collar undone. A precise degree of formality that suggested deliberateness in every choice. The tattoos at his throat were partially visible, dark ink against his skin like a story told in a language I couldn't read. 2 men sat at a separate table near the door, neither looking at us, both positioned to see everything. He rose when I entered. I hadn't expected that. You look well, he said, considering I almost drowned 4 days ago. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The corners of his mouth moved with great restraint, as if smiling were a resource he rationed carefully. Sit. I sat. A server appeared and poured water and vanished. Seungmin looked at me across the candlelight with those focused, measuring eyes, and I had the sensation I'd been having since the bridge, that being seen by this man was categorically different from being seen by anyone else. Not invisible anymore. The opposite of invisible. Pinned. Tell me about yourself, he said. I thought this was about work. It is. He reached for his water glass. Tell me about yourself, I told him. More than I intended to. About the catering, about the meridian, about being 26 and tired and perpetually behind on everything. He listened without interrupting, without checking his phone, without the restless performance of attention that most people offered. He simply listened, his eyes on my face, and it was profoundly uncomfortable, and somehow the most seen I had felt in years. When I finished, the food had arrived without my noticing. Small, exquisite plates that I couldn't have named, but that tasted like something out of a different life than the one I was living. I have a property, Seungmin said. A private residence. It requires someone to manage hospitality for events, occasional guests, the household. He paused. It would require you to live on site. I set down my fork. Live on site, I repeated. The guest suite is larger than your current apartment. He said it without looking at my address, without having been there, stating it as simple fact, which meant he knew what my apartment looked like, which meant someone had looked. The candlelight flickered between us. Somewhere in the restaurant beyond the door, glasses clinked and someone laughed at something. Why me? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. His gaze dropped, briefly, to the necklace at my throat, thin gold against dark skin, and something moved behind his eyes that I couldn't interpret. Because I trust what I've observed, he said, and I've observed enough. It was not an answer. It was a door left deliberately ajar. I should have stood up. I should have thanked him for dinner and walked back out through the main room and taken the subway home and applied for catering jobs online like a reasonable person making reasonable choices. Instead, I heard myself ask, when would I start? The almost smile returned, restrained as ever, dangerous as anything. Monday, he said. Monday arrived before I was ready for it. I packed what mattered into 2 bags, which turned out to be a humbling inventory of how little I'd accumulated in 26 years. Some clothes, books with broken spines, my grandmother's recipe tin, a photograph of my mother taken before she got sick, back when she still laughed with her whole face. I stood in the center of my empty apartment and did a slow turn, memorizing the water stain on the ceiling and the radiator that knocked every night at 2 a.m. like a polite ghost. Then I locked the door, slid the key under the super's door, and went downstairs to where a black car was already waiting at the curb. Not Sung-min. His driver, a different man than the broad-shouldered one from the bridge, younger, who introduced himself as June, and carried my bags with the brisk efficiency of someone for whom this was entirely routine. He didn't ask questions. He drove. The property was 40 minutes outside the city, past the point where the highway thinned and the trees thickened on either side, and the light changed quality. Softer. Older somehow. Filtered through branches that had been growing longer than any of the buildings downtown. We turned off onto a private road marked by nothing visible from the highway. Stone pillars. Iron gate that opened as we approached without June touching anything. A camera mounted high and discreet, its lens tracking. The house emerged from the trees the way significant things sometimes do. Gradually, then all at once. It was large without being ostentatious, the architecture clean and dark, stone and steel and glass in proportions that felt deliberate rather than showy. The gardens were immaculate in the gray November light. 2 men stood near the entrance doing nothing visibly, which meant they were doing everything invisibly. I stepped out of the car and felt, for one irrational moment, as though the gate had closed behind me before I'd heard it move. A woman named Clara met me at the door. She was perhaps 60, Korean, with the posture of someone who had spent decades being indispensable to complicated people. She showed me through the house with the brisk warmth of a person who approved of efficiency and reserved judgment on everything else. The kitchen, professional grade, better equipped than the Meridians. The reception rooms, 2 of them, used for private dinners and occasional meetings. The guest suite assigned to me, on the east wing's upper floor. Large windows overlooking the garden, furniture in shades of slate and ivory, a bathroom with actual water pressure. Mr. Shungmin's schedule varies, Clara explained, standing in the doorway of my suite while I set my bag down and tried not to visibly react to how good the bed looked. He is here perhaps 3 nights a week, sometimes more. When he entertains, you will assist with coordination. Otherwise, the household runs as it runs. She paused. He is private. Guests are not discussed. What happens in this house does not travel beyond it. She said it pleasantly. It landed as precisely what it was. A rule. Understood, I said. She nodded once with the expression of someone filing that response for later evaluation. Then she left me alone in a room that was nicer than anywhere I'd ever slept, in a house that hummed with a particular kind of controlled tension. 40 minutes from the life I'd been living a week ago. I sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, a crow landed on the garden wall and looked at me through the window. I looked back. Neither of us seemed entirely sure what we were doing there. The first 2 weeks were almost ordinary. Seungmin was present intermittently, arriving late, leaving early, the house shifting almost imperceptibly around his presence the way a room shifts when someone important enters it. I learned his rhythms without meaning to. The way you learn the rhythms of any space you inhabit. The low voices in the study in the early mornings. The particular silence that descended when he was on a call. The way June and the other men rearranged themselves when he moved through a room, subtle and constant, like compass needles responding to a magnetic field. My work was real enough. Clara showed me the suppliers, the preferred vendors, the way the household's private dinners were organized. Never more than 8 guests. Always the same private dining room, always the same seating arrangement with Seungmin at the head. I managed logistics, coordinated with the kitchen, ensured things ran without friction. It was work I knew, stripped of the invisibility that had always accompanied it before. Here, I was noticed. Not loudly. But the noticing was present, consistent, like a low current in the walls. Seungmin noticed me most. I told myself this was because I was new. He was assessing me, as he assessed everything, methodically, without sentiment. But there were moments that resisted that explanation. The evening I was reorganizing the reception room for a small dinner and looked up to find him in the doorway, jacket off, watching me with an expression I couldn't categorize. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there. And when I met his eyes, he didn't look away. He held the contact for 3 full seconds before saying simply, "The chairs work better against the wall," and leaving. Or the morning I came down early to find him at the kitchen table with coffee and papers spread around him, the only time I'd seen him look anything other than entirely composed. He had dark circles under his eyes. His hair was slightly disordered. He looked, for that one unguarded moment, like a young man who carried something very heavy and had been carrying it a long time. He looked up when I entered. His expression closed, fast as a shutter. "I'll be out of your way," I said. "You're not in my way." He looked back at his papers. "Coffee is fresh." I poured a cup and sat at the far end of the table, and we existed in the same silence for 20 minutes without speaking, and it was the most comfortable I'd felt in weeks, and that frightened me considerably. The first sign that ordinary wasn't the full picture came on a Thursday. A car arrived that I didn't recognize. Not one of the house's usual vehicles. 2 men got out who moved differently than June or the gate security, with a coiled, watchful energy that raised the hair on my arms. Clara intercepted me in the hallway before I'd reached the reception room, her hand on my elbow, steering me toward the kitchen with a gentle firmness. "Stay here today," she said. "Help me with inventory." "I was going to prepare the inventory," she repeated, and her eyes said the rest. I stayed in the kitchen. Through the closed doors I heard voices, Seungmin's low and controlled, others less so. Once raised and sharp, quickly quieted. The particular silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, the kind that means something has been decided, and the deciding was not gentle. The unfamiliar car left 2 hours later. When Seungmin passed through the kitchen that evening, he paused at the door and looked at me across the room. "You stayed inside," he said. Clara suggested inventory. He studied me for a moment. "Good." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Emma." My name in his mouth still did that thing. Landed differently than it should, weighted somehow. "If anyone you don't recognize comes to this property without advance notice, you come to Clara immediately. Or to me." The way he said to me was not an afterthought. It was, in fact, the sentence. "Okay," I said carefully. He left. I looked at my inventory clipboard and understood, with crystalline clarity, that I had not taken a catering job at all. I had stepped into something much larger and considerably less categorizable, and the exit, if one existed, was not somewhere I could currently see. 3 weeks into my time at the house, one of Seungmin's dinner guests brought a woman. This was unusual. The dinners were always men, always the same quiet formality. But this guest, a broad man with silver at his temples who Seungmin greeted with the careful courtesy reserved for people one does not entirely trust, arrived with a woman on his arm. Beautiful in the architectural way of someone who had spent significant resources on being beautiful, in a red dress that was precisely calibrated to demand attention. She demanded Seungmin's specifically. I noticed because it was impossible not to notice, and because I was managing the dinner's logistics, moving between the kitchen and the dining room, close enough to observe without appearing to observe. The woman spoke to him twice directly. Once near the drinks before dinner, once during the meal itself, leaning across the table in a way that excluded everyone else. Both times, Seungmin responded with the same measured courtesy he gave everything, his body language unchanged, his attention never quite fully awarded. But the third time, she touched his arm, light, brief, her hand on his sleeve for perhaps 2 seconds. I was refilling a water glass at the sideboard. My hand tightened on the pitcher without my permission, and something moved through my chest that I had absolutely no right to feel and recognized immediately as jealousy, which was mortifying. I turned back toward the kitchen. Seungmin's eyes found me across the room at that precise moment. He had not been looking at the woman's hand on his arm. He had been watching me, and now we were looking directly at each other across a candlelit dinner table, while his guest's wife was still technically touching him, and his expression, controlled as it always was, had shifted into something quieter and more deliberate, something that felt almost like a question asked without words. I went back to the kitchen. I set the pitcher down on the counter. My hands were not entirely steady. Clara appeared beside me with the next course, and the discretion of someone who had seen many things and chosen, wisely, to comment on none of them. Later, after the guests had gone and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, I was in the reception room returning chairs to their proper arrangement. The house was dim. Only the lamps on the side tables lit, casting everything in amber pools. I heard him before I saw him. The particular quality of his footfall, measured, deliberate, never careless. "Leave it," he said from the doorway. "It'll take 5 minutes." "Emma." The way he said my name when he wanted my attention was different from every other time. Lower, more direct. "Leave it." I turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with his jacket draped over one arm, his tie loosened, and he was looking at me with an expression that had none of his usual careful architecture. Something beneath the control was visible, just barely, like embers under ash. "The woman tonight," he said. "She means nothing." I went very still. "I wasn't," I started. "You were. Not unkind, simply accurate. And I'm telling you." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had heard in weeks. My heart was doing something unreasonable. The amber light held us both, and outside the windows, the night pressed cold against the glass, and I understood, standing in that room, that something had shifted irreversibly. Not tonight, not with those words, but gradually, over 3 weeks of shared silences and careful distances, and eyes that found each other across rooms without instruction. I understood it. It terrified me, and I said the only honest thing I had left. "You should know," I said, "that I'm not good at this." His gaze didn't waver. Neither am I. He pushed off the door frame and walked away down the dark hallway, and I stood alone in the amber light with a chair in my hands, and my heart making promises my mind hadn't agreed to yet. The morning after the dinner, I woke before dawn and lay in the dark of my suite, listening to the house breathe. That was the only way I could describe it. The property had a respiration, low and constant, the sound of security systems and distant footsteps, and the particular hum of a place that never fully slept. I had grown accustomed to it the way you grow accustomed to a heartbeat that isn't yours. Lying there in the gray pre-light, I cataloged what I knew about my situation with the honesty that only 4 a.m. permits. I was living in a man's house, dependent on his roof and his salary, increasingly unable to look at him without something complicated happening behind my sternum. And that man ran something that sent unfamiliar cars with watchful men to his door and required that I retreat to the kitchen when they arrived. I was not naive. I had assembled the picture gradually, piece by careful piece. The men who materialized and dissolved. The phones, always more than one. The way certain conversations stopped when I entered a room. Not with embarrassment, but with the practiced ease of people who had been managing information their entire adult lives. Clara's careful silences. The gate that knew cars before they announced themselves. I knew what I was living inside. I simply hadn't said it aloud yet, even to myself, because saying it aloud would require deciding what to do about it, and I wasn't ready for that decision. What I was ready for, apparently, was breakfast. I went downstairs. Seungmin was already there. This was becoming a pattern. Him at the kitchen table in the early hours, papers and coffee, that rare, unguarded quality he shed like a coat when he believed no one was watching. He looked up when I came in, and this time he didn't close his expression quickly. He let me see it for a moment, the tiredness, the weight behind the eyes, before composure resettled like a tide coming back in. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." I moved to the coffee maker. "You never actually sleep, do you?" "I sleep." A pause. "Less than recommended." I brought my cup to the table and sat. Not at the far end this time. Closer. A decision I made without fully committing to making it. The way you step off a curb before you've consciously decided to cross. He watched me sit, said nothing about it. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He set down his pen. The gesture meant yes, I had learned, more reliably than words. "The men who came last Thursday, were they a threat to you?" The question sat between us. He looked at me for a long moment. With the particular attention, he gave things he found genuinely interesting, rather than merely relevant. "A negotiation," he said. "That required a conclusion." "And was it concluded?" "Yes." "In your favor?" Something crossed his face, that almost smile, the restrained one. "Always." I wrapped both hands around my cup. The kitchen was warm, the windows dark still, the world outside not yet decided on morning. In the amber quiet of it, I thought, this is the most dangerous place I have ever been comfortable. "I know what you do," I said, not as an accusation, as an acknowledgement. He didn't move, didn't shift or recalibrate, just looked at me steadily across the table and said, "I know that you know." "Does that change anything? For you?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "It changes what I owe you," he said finally. "In terms of honesty." "What does that mean?" "It means—" He stopped, picked up his pen, set it down again, which was, I was realizing, the equivalent of another man pacing the room. "It means that I would like you to stay, and that I want you to make that choice with accurate information rather than incomplete impressions." I stared at him. That's the most careful way anyone has ever told me something significant. I'm a careful person, I noticed. The almost smile again, and this time it traveled slightly further, not quite a real smile, but the territory adjacent to one, and I felt unreasonably proud of having gotten it there. December arrived and brought with it the first event of any real scale. A private gathering, 12 guests, dinner and drinks, the kind of evening where every detail was a statement. Clara and I spent 3 days preparing. The reception rooms were transformed. White flowers I couldn't name, Low candlelight, a string quartet arranged in the corner whose music was elegant enough to be present without demanding attention. I moved through the preparations with the focused energy of someone grateful for tasks that occupied the hands, while the mind resolved other questions. The guests arrived in a procession of dark cars and dark coats. I managed the staff, 3 servers brought in from a trusted agency, vetted apparently by June, with a thoroughness that suggested the vetting involved considerably more than references. I wore a deep green dress that Clara had produced from somewhere without explanation or apology, and I had learned enough by then not to question Clara's productions. Seungmin moved through the evening with the ease of a man in his natural environment. I watched him from the periphery, the way I watched everything in that house, carefully, cataloging. He was magnetic in a way that didn't require performance. People turned toward him without realizing they were doing it, like plants adjusting to light. He spoke little, laughed rarely, and somehow commanded more attention with silence than anyone else in the room managed with conversation. Halfway through the evening, a man arrived late. I didn't know his name. He was perhaps 50, expensively dressed, with the specific confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he appeared uninvited. He moved through the room greeting people, and when he reached Seungmin, the greeting was cordial enough, handshake, brief words, but something shifted in the atmosphere, the way pressure shifts before weather changes. This man's name, I learned later from a fragment of conversation between June and the gate security, was Baek. He found me 40 minutes into his arrival. I was near the sideboard, managing the wine service, when I became aware of him beside me. Too close, angled in a way that cut me off slightly from the rest of the room. "You're new," he said, in English, pleasantly. "I manage the household," I said. He took a glass from the sideboard without asking. "And how long have you been managing Seungmin's household?" There was something in the way he said Seungmin's, a weight, almost satirical, as if the possession implied something he found amusing. "A little over a month," I said. "He keeps his arrangements private." His eyes moved over me in a way that was calibrated to make me aware of his assessment. "I can see why, in this case." I said nothing. I had learned in that house that silence was more powerful than deflection. "Careful, though," he said, quieter now, his eyes moving briefly across the room to where Seungmin stood. "Men like him, their attention is a beautiful thing until it becomes a cage." He smiled pleasantly. "Enjoy your evening." He moved away. I set down the wine bottle with hands that were perfectly steady through an act of pure will, and when I looked up, Seungmin was across the room watching Baek's retreating back with an expression I had never seen on him before. Controlled, yes, always controlled, but beneath the control something cold and absolute. His eyes moved to me. A question. I gave the smallest shake of my head. "I'm fine." Something in him didn't entirely believe me. He excused himself from the conversation he was in, not abruptly, precisely, and the evening continued. And Baek left before dessert without announcement, and no one remarked on it. That night, after the guests had gone and the staff had cleared and the house had returned to itself, I found a knock at my suite door at 11:30. Seungmin, jacket off, both hands in his pockets, looking at me in the doorway with that focused attention that had long since stopped feeling like assessment and started feeling like something more specific. "What did he say to you?" Direct, quiet. I told him. All of it, the exact words, without softening. He listened with his eyes on my face in a stillness that was different from his usual composure, tighter, something moving beneath it like current under ice. "He's not wrong," I said when I finished. Seungmin's gaze sharpened. "About which part?" "About attention becoming a cage." I held his eyes. "I've been thinking about it. Living here, working here. I'm grateful, genuinely. But I don't want to confuse gratitude with something else. And I don't want you to confuse my staying with permission for things I haven't agreed to. The hallway was quiet around us. He looked at me for a long time, and I watched him do something I hadn't seen before. Set aside the architecture of control, deliberately, the way you set down something heavy to show that you chose to carry it. "You're right," he said. I blinked. I expected more resistance to that. "I told you I owed you honesty." He exhaled slowly. "The honest truth is that since the night on the bridge I have been attentive to you, in ways that have not been entirely professional. I'm aware of that. I haven't acted on it because it wouldn't be appropriate given the circumstances." A pause. "But I'm not going to pretend it isn't there. Because you would know, and I have no interest in insulting your perception." Standing in that hallway with my heart doing its unreasonable thing, I thought about the river, the cold, the current, the hands that pulled me up. And then the hotel, the card on the bridge, the dinner, the house, 3 weeks of amber-lit kitchens and chairs against walls, and the woman tonight means nothing. "Sungmin," I said carefully, "what exactly do you want?" He looked at me. "You, not managed, not arranged, just you." The words landed without decoration, without the careful architecture he gave everything else. Raw as the river had been raw. "That's not a small thing to ask," I said, "given everything around you." "I know. No apology in it. Just acknowledgement. And Bayek, men like him, Bayek will not come near you again." Not a threat exactly. A statement of established fact, delivered with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything. That I can promise. I leaned against my doorframe and looked at him. This young man who ran a shadow empire and pulled women from rivers and said always when asked if negotiations concluded in his favor, who kept his windows dark and his phones multiple, and his feelings behind architecture until someone pushed until the architecture shifted. "I need time," I said, "to think. Not because I don't." I stopped. Chose words carefully. Not because the answer is no, but because I need to choose this rather than fall into it. He nodded. The almost smile came and went like weather. "I can wait," he said. He turned and walked back down the dark corridor, and I stood in my doorway long after he had gone, listening to the house breathe, thinking that of all the things he had said to me, those 3 words, "I can wait," were the ones that undid me most thoroughly, because I believed him. And that was the most frightening thing yet. The following week, Beck sent someone to the house. Not himself. A younger man, arriving at the gate at an hour when Sungmin was in the city. He claimed a forgotten item from the dinner. The gate security turned him away. But before he left, he looked directly at the camera. Directly, as if he knew precisely which camera, as if he'd been told. And he held up his phone. On the screen, visible even in the grainy feed, was a photograph. Of me. On the bridge, the night I fell. Someone had been there before Sungmin. Someone had watched and taken a photograph, and waited to use it. Clara brought me the footage without commentary, and stood beside me while I watched it, her hand finding my arm with a steadiness that was the closest she ever came to showing fear. "Does he know?" I asked. "June is calling him now," she said. I watched the footage again. The young man's face, the phone, the photograph. And I understood, with the cold clarity of someone watching a trap close from the inside, that I had not been found on that bridge by accident. Someone had arranged for Sungmin to be there. Someone had arranged for me to fall. The question, the terrible, unavoidable question, was whether Sungmin had known. I sat with that question for 4 hours. 4 hours in my suite with the door locked and the footage playing on a loop in my mind. The young man's face, the phone held up deliberately toward the camera, the photograph of me on the bridge captured from an angle that meant someone had been positioned before I arrived. Before I fell. Before any of it. I thought about the loose grate, the railing that didn't hold. The way those things happen sometimes, genuinely, because the city is old and underfunded and indifferent to its pedestrians. I thought about coincidence, and I thought about what Clara had said on my first day. What happens in this house does not travel beyond it. And I thought about a cream-colored card produced by an old man who had expected me at that bridge before I knew I was going there. And then I stopped thinking and went downstairs to find Seung-min. He was already home. He was in the study, standing, not seated, which was unusual. Both phones on the desk in front of him and June near the door with the expression of a man who had already delivered news he hadn't enjoyed delivering. When I pushed the door open, Seung-min looked up, and whatever he saw in my face made him say something brief to June in Korean. June left, pulling the door closed behind him. We were alone. "Before you speak," he said, "did you know I was going to be on that bridge?" The question landed between us like something dropped from a height. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for composure because he hadn't lost it. But something in his eyes changed. An opening, which from him was the equivalent of another person's collapse. "No," he said. I watched his face. I had spent weeks learning the architecture of his expressions, the geography of what he revealed and what he withheld. And I watched him now with everything I'd accumulated. "But you knew something was happening that night," I said. "You were on that route deliberately." A pause. "I received information that Beck's people were moving something along the river corridor. I was there to observe, not to intervene." His jaw tightened. "I didn't know about you. But Beck knew you'd be there." "Yes." The word came out flat, stripped of everything except its truth. He staged it. He needed leverage over me that couldn't be traced directly to him, something that appeared accidental, that put me in a position of obligation or exposure. His eyes stayed on mine. "He chose you because you were observable, because you crossed that bridge 3 nights a week after your shift, because he'd had you watched long enough to know the grate was faulty and the railing was corroded, and the timing could be arranged." The room was very quiet. "He used me," I said, "to get to you. Yes. And then when you brought me here, when I stayed, he had something else. A different kind of leverage." "Yes." Something moved across his face that was not composure. It was the other thing. The thing beneath. The current under the ice. "Emma, I need you to understand that I did not bring you here because of Bayek. I brought you here because I couldn't—" He stopped. The pause was not a rhetorical one. It was a man choosing between the careful version and the true one. "I couldn't stop thinking about you. From the moment I pulled you out of that water. That had nothing to do with him." I crossed my arms. Not as a barrier, as something to hold on to. "How do I know that?" He moved from behind the desk, slowly, deliberately, the way he moved everything. No gesture wasted, every step intentional. He stopped in front of me with a distance between us that was respectful and also unbearable. "You don't," he said. "Not with certainty. I can't give you certainty. What I can give you is the truth, which is that Bayek wanted me compromised. And instead, I gave him something he didn't anticipate. A reason for me to be considerably more dangerous than I already was." His eyes held mine. "Because the moment he sent that man to my gate with your photograph, he stopped being a professional problem and became a personal one." "That's not reassuring," I said. "I know. It's actually somewhat alarming. I know that too. Despite everything, the locked door, the 4 hours, the cold weight of what I'd learned, something in me responded to the stark honesty of him in a way I couldn't suppress. He wasn't selling me comfort. He wasn't reframing or managing my reaction. He was simply standing in front of me being entirely, unprotectedly true. "What happens now?" I asked. "With Bayek?" "It's being handled. Sung-min." "It's being handled," he repeated, and his tone was gentle but final. A door closed with care rather than force. "You will not be touched. I need you to trust me on this one thing, even if you trust nothing else." I looked at him for a long time. The study was dark except for the desk lamp, throwing shadows up the walls, and he stood in the edge of that light, looking like exactly what he was. A young man who had built an empire out of shadows and was, perhaps for the first time, standing in front of someone he couldn't arrange or manage or protect through sheer force of will alone. "I trust you on that," I said. Something in him released, barely visible, but present. Beck's leverage collapsed within the week. I didn't know the details then, and I know only fragments now. Enough to understand that Sung-min had spent years accumulating information about Bayek's operations with the patience of someone who understood that timing was everything, and that Bayek's move against me had simply accelerated a conclusion that was always coming. The photograph, the staged accident, the young man at the gate, all of it became, in the end, evidence of Bayek's own making that traveled to people with the authority to make his particular variety of problems permanent. Seung-min told me this quietly, one evening in December, seated across from me at the kitchen table in the early dark. He told me without theater, the way he told me everything that mattered, plainly, with the respect of someone who believed I deserved accurate information about my own life. "Is it finished?" I asked. "Yes." "Completely?" "Completely." I nodded. Outside, the first real snow of winter was beginning. I could see it in the lamplight through the window, soft and unhurried, covering the garden in something clean. "I want to tell you something," I said. He waited. "When I called you from the bridge, after the card, after the 2 days I made myself wait to preserve some shred of dignity," a small, self-aware breath, I told myself I was calling about work, that I needed the job, and it was purely practical. I looked at the table, then back at him. That was a lie I was telling myself. I called because I wanted to hear your voice again. The silence that followed was warm rather than weighted. "I know," he said. "You couldn't possibly know." "Emma," the almost smile. "I know." I laughed, a real one, short and surprised, and his expression opened further than I'd ever seen it. Something genuinely delighted moving through it, unguarded and unhurried, and I thought, there it is. There is the person inside all that architecture. He reached across the table and his hand covered mine, not dramatically, not with the weight of declaration, simply his hand over mine, warm and certain, as if it had always belonged there and had only been waiting for the moment to arrive. The months that followed were not without difficulty. I would be lying to romanticize them into something uncomplicated. There were nights when the fear returned, not of him, but of everything around him, the shadow world he moved through, the phone calls that ended when I entered rooms, the men at the gate who changed faces and never names. There were conversations that stopped at my edges. There were moments when I looked at the life I was building inside his orbit and wondered whether I was choosing it or whether I had simply stopped being able to imagine an alternative. Each time I reached that edge, I went to him with it. Directly, without softening. That was the agreement we'd built, unspoken but solid. I would not pretend, and he would not manage me. He would hear the fear and answer it honestly, rather than resolving it through reassurance that cost him nothing. He was not always comfortable to love. His protectiveness had edges that sometimes felt like walls. There were mornings I found June had quietly rerouted my plans without my knowledge. A coffee place I'd mentioned visiting suddenly unavailable. a neighborhood I'd expressed curiosity about somehow impractical. The first time I confronted Seung-min about it directly, he had the grace to look genuinely caught. "You can't arrange me," I told him. "I know." He said it without deflection, which was how I knew he meant it. "And I understand why the instinct is there. I understand what you're afraid of. But if you make my world smaller, trying to keep it safe, it's still a smaller world." I held his gaze. "That matters." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Tell me when I cross it." "I will. Every time." "Every time," I agreed. He wasn't perfect at it, neither was I. But we were honest about the imperfection, and that, I discovered, was its own kind of solidity. Spring came the way springs do after hard winters. Gradually, then with sudden conviction. The gardens around the property went from bare to tentative to genuinely alive over the course of 6 weeks, and I found myself drawn outside in the mornings in a way I hadn't been through the cold months, walking the paths before the day organized itself around us. One morning in April, Seung-min came to find me in the garden. This was unusual. He was not, by nature or habit, someone who sought open spaces in daylight. He appeared at the garden entrance in a gray sweater, hands in his pockets, looking slightly out of his element in the way that privately delighted me. He walked the path to where I was standing near the far wall, where something was beginning to bloom. I didn't know flowers well enough to name it, but it was pale and insistent, and had been pushing through the stone all winter. He stood beside me and looked at it. "Clara says it blooms every year," he said. "Against that wall?" "She says it always finds a way through." I looked at him. He was looking at the flower. The morning light was doing something kind to his face, softening the sharp angles, catching the ink at his throat in a way that made it look less like armor and more like what it probably was, a story written on the outside of a person. He reached into his pocket and produced something small, set it on the garden wall between us, a key. Old-fashioned, not electronic, the kind that opens a specific lock. I looked at it, then at him. "The gate code is being changed today," he said, "to one you set. Not June, not Clara, you." He kept his eyes forward. "And that key is to the study, which has been locked since you arrived." A pause, the kind that holds something significant. "I'd like you to have access to it." I understood what he was offering, not just a key and a code. The study was where the real work happened, the closed conversations, the papers that disappeared, the phones that multiplied. He was opening the door to the part of his life he'd kept between glass, the part I'd always observed from outside. "That's a significant thing," I said. "Yes." "Are you certain?" He turned to look at me then, in the morning light, with that gaze that had never once been casual, focused and direct, and entirely without performance. "You pulled me out of something too," he said. "The night on the bridge. You just didn't know it yet." My throat tightened in the good way. I picked up the key from the wall and held it in my palm, small and solid and real. "I'm not going anywhere," I told him. He didn't say "I know" this time, though I saw it move through his expression. Instead, he reached over and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear with the careful deliberateness of a man doing something for the first time after wanting to, for a very long time. And we stood there together in the April garden, while something pale and persistent bloomed against a wall that had never been designed to allow it, and the gate ahead of us. My code now, my key, my choice, stood open to a world that was dangerous and complicated and entirely, irreversibly, mine. I had fallen into the river not knowing how to trust the water. I was still learning. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting the current.